Thank you. We are very glad to see you here. And our first question is about your philosophical background. Why did you decide to become a philosopher? Who were your university teachers and so on? Please tell us.
Yes, and thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I think my most inspiring teacher was Michael Bratman at Stanford University. And when I was an undergraduate, he introduced me to Harry Frankfurt's work on free will. And as a matter of fact, when I was a junior at Stanford University, many years ago, I first read Harry Frankfurt's famous paper on the relationship between moral responsibility and alternative possibilities. And I've been thinking about it ever since, and it got me very excited about philosophy. I should also say that one of my favorite philosophy teachers at Stanford was Robert Howell. And I took a philosophy and literature course from him, an aesthetics course from him, a Kant course, and he was also very inspirational. I'm not sure why I actually chose philosophy. Part of it was I love thinking about puzzles, and much of my work actually is motivated by puzzles, puzzling situations. And I love to think about puzzles and think about the basic problems of human life, and philosophy gave me that opportunity to do so.
Okay. The debate about free will has a very long history.
Yes.
But modern contemporary philosophy did some significant contribution to the development of the debate. So if you were to name some of the most important contributions of the contemporary philosophers to the free will debate, what would you name?
Yes.
Which works?
Yes. Right away I would think of Peter Strawson's landmark essay, 1962, Freedom and Resentment. This was a very significant essay and contribution in which he argued that we can separate issues of moral responsibility from the traditional metaphysical questions about free will, and it's been extraordinarily influential. I would also right away mention Peter Van Inwagen's 1982 book, An Essay on Free Will. And Van Inwagen really made strides in presenting and clarifying an argument that's been around for hundreds of years, really thousands of years in one form or another, a kind of skeptical argument according to which we may not have free will and moral responsibility. It's often called the consequence argument, but it really goes back to ancient times and arguments for fatalism, and then in the Middle Ages, arguments for the incompatibility of God's foreknowledge and free will. But Peter Van Inwagen, building on the important work of Carl Genet and others in contemporary philosophy, put that argument in probably its most powerful form, in a form that it had never been quite put in the past. And so I would say Peter Van Inwagen's essay is really a landmark. I would also mention Harry Frankfurt's work, the 1969 article to which I referred in the previous question, and also the famous 1971 argument, Freedom of the Will and the Concept of a Person. And Frankfurt made great strides in in clarifying the relationship between the metaphysics and the moral responsibility. I also think very highly of the work of the contemporary philosopher Gary Watson, who is in some ways has affinities to Peter Strawson because he emphasizes the normative side of things rather than the metaphysical. I would also mention Daniel Dennett, whose books, Elbow Room especially, have helped to kind of make connections between the philosophical literature and broader scientific literature, which I think is important. So I would include those philosophers as having made particularly salient and important contributions.
Do you think that the free will problem is mostly a philosophical question, or you suggest that empirical science can actually illuminate the discussion?
I think both. So I think the free will problem is primarily, it's a set of problems. It's a family of different problems, and they're related in complex ways. And actually, some of the real progress that I think we've made on the family of problems is when we see the ways in which the different sub-problems are connected or interconnected in different ways than we might have thought. Just as one important example, traditionally it was thought that in order to be morally responsible, you had to have freedom to do otherwise. You had to have alternative possibilities. But really going back to John Locke, but in contemporary philosophy, Harry Frankfurt has helped us to see that that may not be the case. Maybe we can be morally responsible even if we never have had freedom to do otherwise. So seeing that the issues are not connected in the ways we thought they were is one way that we make progress. So I think the free will set of problems is fundamentally a philosophical family of problems. But I think these issues can also be illuminated by empirical analysis and work. So I think that the empirical work without a philosophical framework is not helpful. But I think philosophical work without the illumination of empirical study is also sterile. It's not really rich. So I think we can do both.
Mm-hmm. Now maybe let's turn to your own famous theory, semi-compatibilism, but not only, rather a bunch of theories.
Yes, thank you.
You say that, claim that your theory, I mean semi-compatibilist, is quite flexible.
Yes.
At the same time, you mentioned that in principle, it could be refuted by some facts. What kind of facts are you talking about?
Yes, good. I'm not sure I think it could be refuted by some facts, but what I think I want to say is that certain facts, which may well be true, could show that we are not morally responsible, even though we think we are. But that still is actually entailed by my semi-compatibilism, or my particular version of semi-compatibilism. So on my account, we act freely, or exhibit what I call guidance control, when we're acting from our own reasons-responsive mechanisms. So one of the real worries that's been brought forward by empirical work is that perhaps human beings aren't good at identifying reasons for action, and we're not good at reacting to the reasons either. So that there is a whole literature in the social sciences, sometimes called the automaticity literature, and the idea is that we're really driven by our emotions, not reason. And reason is something that we read back into our actions. Subsequently, we tell stories or confabulate, but we're really driven by our emotions. Jonathan Haidt, who was my student, my undergraduate at Yale many years ago, has the metaphor of a man riding on an elephant. And the elephant is the emotions and the man is the reason, but the emotions are driving things. So if that turned out to be true, if we really as human beings are not good at identifying reasons and acting on reasons we identify, then I think that would really worry me. Then that would show that we're not morally responsible. But it wouldn't really refute my theory. It would. Now, some people might say, well, since we obviously are morally responsible, if the automaticity literature turned out to show that we're not reasons responsive, then that would refute your theory. I think I would go the other way, because I think if we are not reasons responsive, then really, upon reflection, I don't think we are accountable. Peter Strawson, in his famous essay I talked about, one of the great essays in contemporary philosophy, Freedom and Resentment, started by saying that, of course, we know what reasons we act from. I mean, this was just a datum for him. Now, this is one way in which the philosophical landscape has changed dramatically, and it's changed largely because of empirical work, which suggests that we may not really be very accurate in identifying what's motivating us in our actions, and indeed that our introspective knowledge in general is less reliable than we might have thought. And so, my own view is that semi-compatibilism is true, but that I don't have a knockdown argument for it, that reasonable people can disagree. And if in the end it's going to be refuted, it would have to be refuted by philosophical analysis.
Similar question in some sense. You claim that your theory doesn't depend on truth or falsity of determinism.
Yes.
And that it will not be refuted if future scientists discover that determinism is true after all.
Yes.
But is it possible at all to discover that determinism is true or false? Would it be an empirical discovery, or what? How to discover
Yes.
it is true
Good.
or false?
That's an excellent question, and I don't have a crisp answer. I believe it's an empirical issue whether determinism is true. But I agree that, first of all, if you just look at a theory in physics, it's apparently, according to people who know much more physics than I do, difficult in some cases to tell whether the theory is deterministic or not. So Patrick Suppies, one of my other undergraduate teachers at Stanford, has argued that just by looking at the equations in a theory in physics, it's sometimes very difficult, if not impossible, to see whether it's a deterministic theory. And then surely the mere fact that we don't yet have a theory of everything that's deterministic doesn't show that we can't or that we won't. So what I would say is, the short answer is, I don't know exactly how we would establish the truth of determinism one way or the other. My guess is, if in the future physicists developed a set of equations to say, I guess the form of a physical theory might be differential equations. We tend to think of them as conditionals, like if this is true, if this set of factors are true, then these events will occur. But really, they'll probably be very long sets of differential equations. If a physical theory can be developed like that, that has, over time, perfect predictive power, then I think at a certain point we would conclude determinism is true. Now, many physicists think that quantum mechanics shows that determinism is false. But I think the jury is out. Other physicists think that there are deterministic interpretations of quantum mechanics, and I don't think there is any settled opinion on that yet.
It seems that in the free will debate, it is very important where you start. So, for instance, if you start from the conviction that there is moral responsibility, and from there you can argue to some kind of compatibilism. We can start from natural sciences, and if you stand on a deterministic background, then you can become an incompatibilist. And you can believe in the non-existence of free will and moral responsibility. So what are your starting points and how you justify them?
Good. Well, yes, starting points are very important. And the more I've worked in this area and thought about arguments, my own arguments and others' arguments, the more I'm struck by how important your starting points are and the dialectical assumptions that you're making. That is, what needs to be established versus what is just presupposed it's extraordinarily important, it turns out, in evaluating these very complex debates. I guess let me just say, I think that a very helpful way of thinking about how to argue about free will and moral responsibility is to think of us as addressing idealized agnostics. So people who, they're agnostic in the sense that they haven't already got a view about whether determinism is true or whether compatibilism is true or incompatibilism. They're not yet skeptics about moral responsibility. They haven't yet accepted moral responsibility. So they're agnostic and they're open-minded, fair-minded, rational people. So that this is an idealization. We're just imagining these kinds of idealized agnostics. Peter van Inwagen, in his book on the problem of evil, actually, the 3rd chapter, discusses this kind of methodology. So I think it's not helpful often to think, how can I persuade an incompatibilist, someone already committed to incompatibilism, that compatibilism is true, and vice versa? Or how can I take someone who is a committed moral skeptic and convince her that there is moral responsibility? Often that's not going to work, or you're not going to get anywhere. But I think it's better to think of us all as addressing open-minded, fair-minded, rational agnostics, and then see whether we can tip the scales a little in our argumentation and make it a little more likely that an agnostic would accept our view. I should say, so that's my general methodology, but I also come to these debates with certain starting points of my own. I'm antecedently inclined toward materialism about the mind, so I'm a physicalist, although I want my theories of responsibility to be consistent with dualism as well as physicalism. Antecedently, I'm inclined to think that we are morally responsible in some cases, and that determinism might well be true. On the other hand, I try not to rely too heavily on those antecedent inclinations, because what I want to do is appeal again to someone who's an idealized, fair-minded, rational agnostic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In responsibility and control, you suggest a method of reflective equilibrium.
Yes.
For dealing with the free will problem. And I think you already touched base but can you explain in more detail how you apply that method?
Yes.
To the free will?
Yeah, the term comes from John Rawls' theory of justice, and it's really a term that describes a methodology in philosophy that I think is pervasive to analytic philosophy. It's not just in this area or in ethics, but throughout. And in fact, David Lewis talks about this in his book on the plurality of worlds, and he says, even in very abstract metaphysics, there are certain intuitions that we have about phenomena, and we want to preserve our core intuitions, and so we formulate principles and theories, and we test those principles and theories against our intuitions, and we kind of go back and forth, and we adjust our principles sometimes, and we adjust our intuitions until we get this kind of homeostasis or this equilibrium. And I think it's hard to avoid something like this methodology in philosophy. I think some philosophers want to reject it, but it's not clear what you put in its place. I mean, you could start with axioms and derive conclusions, but then if the conclusions are really implausible, that should make you rethink your axioms. I mean, so I don't see exactly how you can avoid this kind of methodology. Now, in the moral responsibility, free will debates, I think we have some considered judgments about who is morally responsible and who isn't. We start with the idea that people who are literally psychotic or delusional or have certain mental disorders that make it impossible for them to conform their decisions to reasons, that they are literally incompetent agents, or they're not morally responsible. And then we might have considered intuitions about hypothetical cases involving brainwashing and manipulation and direct control of one's brain through a microchip that's electronically stimulating one and so forth. We don't think those agents are morally responsible, and yet we think people like you and me who have developed the normal mechanisms of control and are not mentally ill are morally responsible. And I think part of the project is to capture those distinctions and those intuitions by presenting general principles and theories that kind of are in equilibrium with those intuitions. Now, it's really important and interesting to consider skeptical worries that call into question our intuitions. But again, what makes those skeptical worries so powerful is they're really relying on some, perhaps different intuitions to generate the skeptical challenges to other intuitions. So I think the way it gets applied, I'd say in the first instance in the moral responsibility debate, is that upon reflection, we do think that we can make distinctions among agents, some of whom we might say are in control of their behavior and can be legitimately held responsible, others of whom are not. And then we try and figure out, well, how do we explain and systematize those intuitions? And then once we've done that, how does that relate to worries about determinism or God's foreknowledge or fatalism? Okay.
One of the central part of your theory is the concept of guidance control.
Yes.
It seems that you believe that guidance control is sufficient for moral responsibility. But how do you think, is it possible to construct a robot which will be able to realize a guidance control in its actions? That is, to make a machine, a robot, with required appropriate mechanisms and ability to treat actions as its own.
Yes, good question. So I should just say, as background, I go back to Aristotle in thinking that there are two conditions that are necessary for responsibility: a freedom condition and an epistemic condition. And so the freedom condition is not in itself sufficient. It's only in conjunction with the knowledge or epistemic condition. Aristotle said we don't act voluntarily when we act from force or ignorance. So, but you're right, I think that guidance control is the freedom relevant condition that's sufficient. It's all the freedom that we really need for moral responsibility. Now, you're right, then there are challenges to the idea that guidance control is the only kind of freedom we need. Here, of course, the basic idea is that we don't need freedom to do otherwise, or regulative control. But once you're willing to say that, then you're open to worries about manipulation. Let's say the mechanism is implanted by nefarious neurosurgeons or, secretly. And what my co-author, Mark Revisa, and I have done in developing the idea of guidance controls, we've attempted to address those worries by saying the mechanism has to be the agent's own suitably reasons-responsive mechanism. So it's not just that it's a reasons-responsive mechanism, but it has to be the agent's own. So certain forms of inculcation or manipulation would not be consistent with the ownership, but we have to argue. But now, your very good question, could you design a robot that in principle would turn out to have guidance control. I think that might well be possible in the future. That is, I'm not sure what I think about, I mean, I would say this, there's no currently existing computers or robots that are conscious or that can be reasons responsive in the way that you would need, in the sophisticated way that you would need to be to have guidance control. But I'm open to the idea that in the future there could be artificial intelligence. That is, that there could be intelligence and thought instantiated in machines that are artificially created. I mean, I think of us as complex machines, very complex machines that are made of different material than computers. But I do think that we are machines. I think there's no conceptual bar to there being conscious computers in the future, in which case, in principle, if the computer is acting from its own reasons responsive mechanisms, then we'd say that computer is morally responsible. But there's no current computer that has that sophistication. And let me say further that if the computer was programmed in such a way that external programmers are always calling the shots, then it wouldn't be acting from its own appropriately reasons responsive mechanism. So it's complicated. I think there's no computer now that would qualify under my conditions of ownership and reasons responsiveness. But I wouldn't rule it out that in 100 years, if the human beings are still here and we're making computers, that we couldn't have very sophisticated computers.
Where is this borderline for sophistication of responsive mechanism, responsiveness of such mechanism?
Yeah.
How would you describe this borderline?
I don't have. That's a good question. It would have to be. So, I think this is something I have not sufficiently attended to in my work thus far, but I think that consciousness is a requirement for moral responsibility. I think of it as, I think that in order to recognize reasons and recognize them as reasons, one would have to be conscious. And therefore, a computer of the future that's responsible would have to be conscious. And this is a great problem, as you know. I don't have the solution to that as when exactly the mechanism is conscious. But what I would say is it would have to be conscious. And whatever line there is, passing which an organism or a machine becomes conscious, that's the line that you would need to pass to be responsible. But I think there are interesting questions about the relationship of consciousness and responsibility that I have not really explored sufficiently in my work. I assumed, along with my colleague Mark Revisa, that any organism that's reasons responsive would have to be conscious. We didn't actually, I think, explicitly say that.
Well, one of your core assumptions is that there is responsibility. Some of the agents, some of the humans are more responsible.
Yes,
And some of them aren't.
yes.
So do you think that there is a sharp borderline between those two categories? Is this possible to distinguish?
No, I think what you have here are clear cases on either side, and then a bunch of cases in between. So I think there are clear cases of agents who are not morally responsible. They're delusional, or they may have severe Alzheimer's disease, or they're infants. They are not morally responsible, or they're mere animals. They act from instinct, but they have no capacity to step back from their instincts and evaluate them in terms of reason or morality, and they don't have the mechanisms of control. So I would say clear cases of no responsibility and clear cases of responsibility where we have no reason to think that someone has been drugged or manipulated or hypnotized or abused in their past in such a way that they can't control their behavior. So we have clear cases on either side, but then there are relatively clear cases on either side, but then there's going to be a set of cases about which we're not sure what to say, and even maybe agents who are in between and about which we're not sure whether they're fully morally responsible or not. I think just developmentally, there will be, let's say, adolescents who we don't think of young children as morally responsible, though we try to educate them by a process of tentatively and for some purposes acting as if they are responsible and reacting to them, praising them, blaming them, getting them over time to develop the capacities for reasons responsiveness and the capacities relevant to responsibility. But they're not morally responsible when they're very young, and when they're adults, they often are morally responsible. But then there may be a time when they're 14 years old or 16 or 18 where they're kind of in between. And in some ways they are, and in some ways they're not responsible. I have a colleague, Eric Schwitzgebel, who has a very interesting blog on philosophy of mind. Very interesting. And he talks about belief in this way, that he thinks that to believe something is to have a number of different dispositions. And if you have all of those dispositions, you have the belief. If you have none of them, you don't. But there may be in-between cases where you have some of the dispositions and not others. And then you're a state of in-between believing, where it's not the case that you definitely believe and it's not the case that you definitely don't. I'd say the same thing about moral responsibility.
In your theories, you suggest that guidance control, as we spoke before, is sufficient for the moral responsibility. But do you also think that the guidance control is sufficient for the value of human life?
Good question. Yes, I think, well, my view is that human life has a special kind of value that's not shared by mere animals, and certainly that's not shared by non-sentient, non-conscious beings. You know, a non-sentient being, an object, can have value in the sense of it's very useful or it's very beautiful, but then sentient creatures, animals, let's say, have value, their lives have value, but the value of those lives are just a matter of adding up their welfare at the different times of their lives. So a cow's life is valuable objectively and also subjectively. It's valuable to the cow, and there is, I think, an objective value to the cow's life, but that's a matter of adding up the welfare it has over its lifetime. And though we can tell the story of a cow's life, I would say we live stories in a very different way. It's not just that you can describe our lives, like you can describe, or in some sense tell the story of a cow's life. We live lives that are genuinely narratives, that have some of the crucial features of narrativity. And one of the most important features of narrativity is meaning holism, or the idea that the meaning of a part, or the value of a part of life, is dependent on its relationship to other parts of our lives. And I would say that's not the case with a cow or with a dog, but with us, with human beings. Let's say when we learn from our past mistakes and thrive because of our efforts and our hard work and learning, that changes the meaning of those past events from which we're learning. Now, those past events have a value. So what my view is that it's in virtue of our acting freely that we have this special narrative dimension. And so it is in virtue of exhibiting guidance control that we transform our lives from just sequences of events that you can describe as a chronicle to stories, or genuine stories or narratives. And so, yes, I think it's necessary as well as sufficient for having that special kind of value, that narrative value, that's not reducible to welfare, aggregation of welfare over time. I borrow some of these ideas from important work by the contemporary philosopher David Velleman, but it's my view, I add an element to Velleman's theory, and I add the element that it's in virtue of exhibiting guidance control that we have this irreducible narrative dimension of value. And I should just say, in Dirk Pereboom's recent book, he calls this idea into question. He argues that it's not in virtue of exhibiting free will at all, and not specifically guidance control, that we have this narrative dimension. But that's one place where Pereboom and I disagree.
You make a subtle difference between agent and mechanism
Yes.
of action.
Yes.
Let's take a Frankfurt type example, a bit modified. And suppose that after Jones, one of the heroes,
Yes.
after Jones decided to vote for Republicans, Black forced Jones to vote for Democrats by stimulation of his brain.
Yeah.
Is it correct to say that it was Jones who voted, or rather it was Black who voted using Jones' body as an instrument?
Mm-hmm.
Who is an agent here?
Good. So, in the Frankfurt cases, the envisaged intervention is hypothetical. It doesn't actually happen. So as things actually develop, Jones chooses and votes for the Democrat on his own. But if he had been inclined to, but we can ask then about the alternative scenario, yes, in which the neuroscientist or Black intervenes. Now, there are different ways of describing the situation, and I don't want to press for one way rather than the other. One way you could describe it would be to say that Black causes Jones to choose to vote for the Democrat and to vote for the Democrat. So it's actually Jones who's choosing and voting.
Black, you mean?
No, I'm saying this is here. So one way of describing it would be it's Jones. Mm-hmm. Jones is choosing, Jones is voting, though as a result of Black's decision. And that's kind of congenial with the deterministic picture, because under determinism, you do want to say our choices and our decisions can have causal antecedents that trace back outside of us, and maybe you can't distinguish between different kinds of causal antecedents with regard to agency. So you might distinguish with regard to moral responsibility. So one way of doing it would be to say, and I think this was the way Frankfurt described it, that Jones is choosing and Jones is acting even though he was caused to do that by Black in the alternative scenario. But another way of doing it would be to say, no, if Black intervenes in that way, then you can't really call it a choice of Jones. It's really Black acting there. Mm-hmm. And that's okay with me. I mean, because my view, let me just say, my view is these cases show, not decisively or not in a way that every reasonable person would have to agree, but they tend to show that an agent can act freely and be morally responsible, even though he couldn't have done otherwise. Now, on the first way of describing things, he couldn't have done otherwise because he was acting and choosing in that alternative scenario just the same way as he did actually. But in the other way of describing it, he still can't do otherwise. Now, he would...
But he didn't vote.
Right, in the other case, but he, let me put it this way. He didn't, in the alternative sequence, if you describe it as Jones is not choosing and not acting, it's still, and I agree that it becomes a little trickier to make my point. What I would want to point out, though, is he didn't voluntarily refrain from choosing to vote for the Democrat. He didn't voluntarily he didn't voluntarily refrain from choosing to vote for the Republican, and he didn't voluntarily vote for the Democrat. So what I've argued is, if the alternative possibility is really to ground moral responsibility, it has to be robust. It has to, and in the kind of scenario that you're imagining, in which Jones doesn't choose to vote for the Democrat because he's been manipulated, I would say that's not a robust alternative possibility. So, though he does have, you could call it, I like to call it a flicker of freedom. So in that case, there is an alternative possibility. There's a flicker of freedom. Jones doesn't choose to vote for the Democrat, and he doesn't vote for the Democrat. That's because black is really doing it. But that can't ground his moral responsibility, because though it is an alternative sequence, it's not one that he envisaged or took account of, and it's not grounded, it's not voluntary or intentional. So here, I actually am in agreement with Robert Kane, who's the famous indeterministic and libertarian philosopher. And what he says is, in order to have moral responsibility, you have to have dual voluntariness. Voluntariness in the actual sequence and voluntariness in the alternative. And in a case like this, if you describe it as Jones is not choosing, Jones is not acting, it's an alternative, but there's no voluntariness.
But what if Jones decided to vote, and then, only then, black forced him?
Yes, then I would say, very good. And there I would say, intuitively, Jones is morally responsible for well, let's see. Let's go through it. In fact, Jones deliberates, and he thinks that voting for the Democrat is the best thing, and he does decide to vote for the Democrat.
For Republicans. He decided to vote for Republicans.
I'm sorry, yes.
Black forced him to vote for Democrats.
Yes, sorry. Sometimes even I get confused about these examples. Okay, so he decides to vote for the Republican, and then after that decision, black intervenes and causes him in a certain way to vote against his will to vote anyway for the Democrat. So in that case, what does one want to say? Well, I would say Jones is responsible for the choice to vote for the Republican. He's not responsible for voting for the Democrat. He was manipulated, and so this is a case, it's not a Frankfurt case in my view. And let's say, here, this may be a better way of putting it. He actually chooses to vote for the Democrat and votes for the Democrat. But if he had been inclined to choose to vote for the Republican, he would have chosen to vote for the Republican, but then he would have been forced to vote for the Democrat anyway. There, what I'd want to say is, he did have an alternative possibility. He's morally responsible, but he had an alternative possibility that was robust, because he could have voluntarily chosen to vote for the Republican. So that's not, I agree, that's not helpful for my cause at all, or that does not show that you could be responsible without a robust alternative, because there you are responsible, but you do have a robust alternative. Your robust alternative is, Jones could have chosen to vote for the Republican. So what I need, and what Frankfurt needs, is an example where intuitively we'd say the agent's responsible, but there aren't any robust alternatives. And really what's great about these examples is that they actually go back to, I think, Chrysippus in ancient times. And Chrysippus talked about a man who was walking a dog, was running along, and his dog was running, but he had a leash on the dog, but the leash never played any role because the dog was happy to run along with him. And then John Locke in the 18th century came along and had a case of a man who was locked in a room and stayed in the room voluntarily, even though the door was locked. He didn't know the door was locked. It was like Chrysippus's dog. But Frankfurt in 1969 added this interesting dimension, because you could say, well, the dog at least could have tried to stop and could have decided to stop and could have at least tried to stop, then it would have been dragged along. But it did have an alternative possibility. And the man in the room could have walked over to the door. So Frankfurt added the dimension that somehow even the choice is taken away. And that, of course, is an exciting idea, but then has led to a tremendous amount of controversy about whether the examples are coherent.
You mentioned Derek Pergel before, and one of his big contribution is the four-case manipulation argument. Can you explain what is your main objection to that?
Okay. Yes, it's a very sophisticated development of the manipulation argument against compatibilism. That's the basic idea that what all manipulation arguments have in common is that a scenario, you start with a scenario where we would all think there's no moral responsibility, someone is secretly being manipulated. And then you argue that there's no difference in principle between that case and causal determinism. And I think Pereboom has developed the argument in a powerful and interesting way. But I would definitely disagree with his conclusion. And my disagreement is, I think there are differences along the way between certain of the cases. So what I think is, so Pereboom thinks in all of his cases, and what happens is you start with a case, they're all cases in which Professor Plum kills an innocent person white. And in the first example, there is direct manipulation, secret manipulation of the person's brain, which issues in Plum's killing white. In the second case, you don't have direct hands-on manipulation. It's just that the scientists have set Plum up from the beginning with a program that makes it likely that he will go ahead and kill white. And in the third case, it's just Plum's upbringing, his parents and his church and so forth issue in the same kinds of urges. And then in the final case, you just have determination, causal determination. Pereboom argues they're all the same because he argues the relevant factor is being caused to do what you do by a factor that traces back, beyond you, beyond your control. That traces to something outside of your control. That whenever you're causally determined to choose or act by some factor that's outside of your control, you're not responsible. I think the main problem with that is that's too blunt an instrument. That is too strong an explanation of the cases. So what I think is going on is that in the first case, the agent is acting from a reasons responsive mechanism, but it's not his own. In the first case, because the scientists secretly manipulate him, Plum is not acting from his own reasons responsive mechanism. So that explains why in the first case, the agent's not responsible. But in the second case, there's no hands-on manipulation. It's just that he starts with certain predispositions. And I think that's completely consistent with Plum's acting from his own reasons responsive mechanism. Because that's just like we all are. We all start with certain predispositions. The fact that scientists with certain mental states and intentions are the ones that set him up that way, to me, really doesn't make a difference. To me, whether nature puts those predispositions in us, genetics or even our early background, or whether neuroscientists put them in, really doesn't matter. So, okay, I'll just simplify as much as I can. I think in the first case, in which there's hands-on manipulation that the agent hasn't consented to, Plum is not morally responsible because he's not acting from his own reasons responsive mechanism. It's the scientist's mechanism. But in the second case, he is acting from his own mechanism, and the fact that a scientist set him up to do that, but then left him alone, does not show that he's not responsible. I think there's no difference between that kind of case and everyone who starts with certain genetic predispositions. So I think you can get the incompatibilist conclusion by invoking this factor that Dirk Pereboom invokes, i.e. the idea that whenever you're caused to do what you do by something that's traceable to a factor outside of your control, whenever that's true, you're not responsible. Yes, you can get incompatibilism, but that's way too strong an instrument to illuminate the cases. And the instrument we need is guidance control. And we can see in some cases there's guidance control, and in other cases there isn't. So I actually would go back. This is the strategy that I would use in the four-case argument. It's the same strategy I used in my book, 1994, The Metaphysics of Free Will, where I started with thought experiments involving nefarious neurosurgeons and so forth, where there was secret manipulation of the brain. And then in my book, I asked the question, would we all be just like that if determinism obtained? And what I said is, no, there's no reason to think that all causal sequences are created equal, that some rob us of our guidance control. They're like the nefarious surgeon, a neurosurgeon who robs us of our guidance control. But other sequences can be deterministic, but leave in place guidance control. And so, I mean, I take very seriously these manipulation worries, but I try and address them. I mean, this is one way, see, to situate my work with that of Daniel Dennett, who has also done an interview with the center. Daniel Dennett really suggested this idea of reasons responsiveness in his book, Elbow Room, and previous work. It was very important, and I agree with Dennett. I mean, he argued if you distinguish, if you think about certain insects, like he talked about the sphex, and he talked about sphexischness, which is a kind of tropism where you behave the way you do no matter what your environment is like, and you're not sensitive to the cues of your environment. So he wanted to contrast us, where we are reasons responsiveness, with this wasp that's sphexish and tropistic. So we agree, Dennett and I agree, that what we're looking for in moral responsibility is reasons responsiveness. Now, but we disagree a bit on how seriously we take the manipulation arguments, because I think Dennett wants to think that he's very skeptical whether you could really ever have a case of manipulatively induced or inculcated mental states. He thinks mental states have to hang together in a certain way that resists inculcation. But I'm willing to accept that. I'm willing to accept that there can be manipulative inculcation of beliefs and desires, but I still think you can say that they're not consistent with responsibility because they don't leave in place guidance control.
Can you expand a little bit on your differences with Daniel Dennett?
Yeah. Well, like I say, our agreements are bigger than our disagreements, I think. We agree about compatibilism, about determinism and moral responsibility. We agree that a freedom worth caring about and that grounds responsibility is consistent with determinism. And we think that a good way to understand moral responsibility is in terms of reasons responsiveness. Now, one way it's not a disagreement, but a difference is I give a characterization, a more specific characterization of reasons responsiveness that seeks to capture the kernel of truth in the Frankfurt cases. So I believe in holding fixed the actual kind of mechanism, distinguishing the alternate sequence mechanism from the actual mechanism, and fixing on the properties, the responsiveness characteristics, or the responsiveness profile of the actual mechanism. So that's a kind of analytic device that's not in Dennett, but you could say it's an extension of his work. So I want to give a particular kind of characterization of the reasons responsiveness that captures the lesson, I think, of the Frankfurt cases and the broader point that we don't need alternative possibilities to be responsible. I think Dennett's approach would be to say that, well, we do care about a kind of freedom that is more abstract than the libertarian conception of freedom, that doesn't hold fixed all the antecedent conditions and laws of nature. But I think he thinks of it as an alternative possibilities kind of freedom, whereas I think of it as an actual sequence notion of freedom. So we disagree there, I think, as well. But what I was referring to earlier is I think methodologically I'm much more inclined to grant to the skeptic the possibility of manipulation and then try to respond to the skeptic on her own terms. I mean, say, okay, let's grant you that you could have a neurosurgeon tampering with your brain secretly and inducing values and desires. I still think we can respond as compatibilists, and we can say, but those are not reasons responsive sequences. But I think Dennett is much more inclined to call into question the coherence of the thought experiments and say we really couldn't have the kinds of secret inculcation of beliefs and desires that the skeptic is speaking about.
Some of your books are written together with Mark Ravitza.
Yes.
You mentioned today. Can you specify the details of this collaboration?
Yes, well, this is an interesting story, met Mark Ravitza at Yale University, and he was a graduate student who had come to Yale to study Heidegger. Mm-hmm. And his mentor, Karsten Harries, said, well, you've never taken a course in analytic ethics, so you should take something from John Fischer. And I wasn't teaching that semester, I was on sabbatical, but I agreed to do an independent study with him on moral responsibility. And we started reading and discussing the work by Harry Frankfurt and Gary Watson and Peter Strawson. And he got very interested in it, and so he asked if we would do more independent study, and I did it. And over time, he developed a very strong interest in the analytic work on free will and moral responsibility. So he left Heidegger and began to work with me at Yale on his dissertation on moral responsibility. Then I left Yale and went to the University of California in Riverside, and he finished up his PhD at Yale, and then we hired him at the University of California, and he was my colleague for 2 years at the University of California. And so we worked together during a period of a decade while we were at Yale University, where I was an associate professor in the philosophy department, and he was a graduate student, and then subsequently when he was at University of California. But Mark has always had an interest in going into the Jesuits, and after a couple years at the university, he decided to begin a different career in the Jesuits, and so he began to study to be a priest, and he increasingly grew less interested in analytic philosophy and more interested in the ecumenical life of the priesthood. And so over time, after we completed our final work together, responsibility and control, he focused more on his ecumenical work and less on philosophy. So he became a professor at Santa Clara University, which is a Jesuit university in California, and he's currently at a university in the Philippines working with the indigenous people and also mentoring them. And he teaches a philosophy course on suffering. How did we work together? In other words, I've actually done a lot of work with other authors. I've worked with Anthony Bruckner and Neil Tognazzini and Patrick Todd, and also with Mark Revisa. And the collaboration works a little differently in each case. But often with Revisa, we would have discussed an issue for many hours. Maybe we had been reading some literature, or he had been writing his dissertation, and then I was giving him comments, and then we would have many hours of discussion. And if we felt that there was an idea that came out of our discussions that really wasn't owned by one of us rather than the other, that somehow the idea emerged from a joint conversation, then we would write it up as something that was our joint product. But sometimes and most of the time, I would write the rough draft based on our discussion. Then I would give it to him, and then he would either add a section or make extensive notes, and then I would revise, and then we would go back and forth and maybe have 10 drafts. There were a few cases where he would write the first draft, and then I would give comments or add a section, and then we'd go back and forth. But it was always a matter of going over the entire product, each of us, many times. So it wasn't as if I wrote a part of it and he wrote a part of it and we put it together. That happens in the sciences, I think. And that's why the scientists have trouble evaluating philosophical joint work. But when we write something together, we have to agree on every single sentence. And with Mark, it was mostly because of our personalities and our different level of experiences, I would typically write the first draft. But I would say with Anthony Bruckner, with whom I've written a series of articles on death, and with Patrick Todd, with whom I've written on God and free will, often it's the other author who writes the first draft, and then I'll take over from there, as it were. So it happens in different ways. And I actually, I really enjoy writing with other authors, even though it can be easier because you have someone else to share the work, but it can be more difficult because you have someone else who has to come together with you, and you have to get someone else to agree with you, and sometimes that's not possible. And sometimes, if I'm writing my own article and I have a certain way of making a point, I will go ahead and make it in that way, and I don't have to convince anyone else that that's okay. But when I'm writing with someone else, I can't just do that. I have to convince them that that's the way to do it. And sometimes we'll go back and forth, and I'll just finally give up and say, okay, or I'll convince the other one to give up. But I think it makes philosophy less lonely. Philosophy tends to be lonely because we go and we work at our desks, and we write, and we spend hours and hours. And then sometimes when we publish, we don't know who's reading the stuff, and it might be years before someone sends you an email and say, I like your paper, or I don't like your paper. But if you're working with someone, then it's less lonely. It's more of a communal activity.
In Our Stories, your other book, you suggest that human life has a narrative value, and can you explain a little bit more about the narrative value of
Yes.
human life?
So I think that we have this dimension of value, or a way of evaluating human lives that's not reducible to just adding up or agglomerating, adding up the levels of happiness or welfare at the different times. I think part of the way we evaluate human lives is in terms of welfare or happiness. But there is something else about flourishing or thriving, something that makes certain lives more meaningful, more valuable than others, that's not reducible to adding up happiness. And it's this narrative dimension. It's the way our stories go. But now it's tricky because the idea is not purely an aesthetic idea that would be, let's say, the idea that a literary critic or a film critic would have in evaluating a story. So a film critic might say the narrative of the film was really boring or really exciting, or a literary critic might say that was a really good story. And what the individual has in mind is that perhaps there were twists and turns that were not easily predictable, but that upon reflection you could see they made sense, or they were foreshadowed, but you couldn't really tell in advance how the story would go, or the story resonates in some way or shows something about human character or human nature that's really important that we can learn from. I'm not really talking, when I talk about narrative value, about that, the idea of a good story in the sense of unpredictable twists and turns. That might or might not make a life more meaningful. What I'm talking about is the idea that, okay, so here, one example would be this. Let's say you have a very close relationship, a marriage, a close friendship, a business arrangement, and for 10 years, you struggle. You're both members, let's say, of the marriage, both members of the couple are unhappy in certain ways, and you struggle. And then after 10 years, now we're going to tell two different stories, or there are two different continuations. In one continuation, the members of the couple learn from the mistakes and the problems and the struggles of the first 10 years. And based on the lessons that they learn, they change and they live happily together. And in the other scenario, they just give up. They struggle for 10 years and then they just walk away from the marriage. But just by accident, they both happen to live happily after that as well. Maybe even though they haven't learned any lessons, they find someone else who is more compatible with them and they live happily. I think there's greater value in the first scenario because it's a story where the parts relate to each other in a certain distinctive way. You flourish not just by accident or not just by luck, but by hard work and overcoming mistakes or learning from mistakes in your first 10 years of marriage. And because you've learned and you've worked hard and you flourish, you flourish because of your hard work rather than just by luck. So there's a certain kind of relationship between the rest of your life and the first 10 years of your marriage that gives it a higher score, I think, than the score that you get when you just meet someone and by luck you do well. Here's another example. You might work very, very hard. An individual may work very hard to get into medical school. In the United States, it's very hard to get into medical school. And you work very hard, and now maybe the individual wants to help other people, also wants to make a good living so they can travel, they can live well. That's why they want to go to medical school. They work very hard. And in the first scenario, the individual succeeds. And because of, let's say it's she, because of her hard work and effort, she gets into medical school and she is able to help other people when they're ill and also make a good living and have a happy life. But in the other case, she doesn't get into medical school. She tried very hard and worked equally hard, but she doesn't get in. But a year after that, hearing that she wasn't accepted to medical school, she wins the lottery. And because she wins the lottery, she has enough money now to engage in helping other people through charity, and also she has a happy life, equally happy to the first case. Well, people can disagree, but I think there is more narrative value in the first scenario, where she thrives because of her hard work, rather than just as a windfall or a luck, like in the second. So I think those are examples. Those are two kinds of examples where individuals have differing scores on this irreducibly narrative dimension of value. And the scores are based on distinctive kinds of relationships between periods of one's life, where you could say success is either because of learning from mistakes and hard work or because of luck. Or success is either because of conscientious hard work or luck. And it matters, I think, which way it goes. These are, in some sense, why do we call them narrative? Well, it's partly because the meanings of the parts are in some way dependent on their relationship with the other parts. So think of it this way: when you have 10 years of struggle and unhappiness in marriage, but the individuals learn, and then they change and they thrive because of what they've learned, that changes the meaning of those first 10 years. They're now not just a deadweight loss, but they're in some way infused with a different kind of meaning. And so, again, the idea of narrativity, I think, is importantly the idea of meaning holism, where the value of a part depends on its relationship to another part. That's what I said before, that's what we give to our lives by acting freely. And I think that's what I'm getting at when I think of this idea that we, as opposed to mere animals, have this special kind of evaluation.
But you give examples that are very positive.
Yeah.
If you would you agree that the narrative value can be attributed to a life that's totally different? For
Yeah.
instance, a person as a child is dreaming of having power and manipulating other people.
Yes.
And then he grows into the scientist whose name is Black, and he's manipulating all people everywhere. And he's, does that kind of life also have a high narrative value?
It could. So I'm operating here in the tradition that distinguishes, very importantly, at least three different kinds of evaluation. One would be moral evaluation of the life. So it sounds like in that case, the individual scores very low in moral evaluation. Someone like Hitler or Saddam Hussein, very low on the morality scale. But they might have very meaningful lives. I mean, their lives might have been very meaningful, and they might have had a lot of the narrative value. But that doesn't mean that they were morally valuable. I would also distinguish these notions from aesthetic notions, like in other words, a life could be good in a good story in the telling, which would be, maybe there are all sorts of unexpected twists and turns and dramatic events in one's life. I don't think that necessarily makes it morally a better life or even more meaningful. If I go home and next fall I teach my philosophy seminar, and every day I go and I prepare and I go to my seminar and I teach it, it sounds like it's not a very interesting story. It would be much more interesting is if I go and midway through the term, one of my students takes a knife out and comes and stabs me. Very unexpected, very interesting, could be very dramatic. But that doesn't make it, that doesn't make my life more meaningful, but it's a more interesting story in the telling. And so I would distinguish meaningfulness, aesthetic goodness of a story, and also the moral question. And some people become confused because they think meaningfulness and morality have to go together, but I think they're different. I think Susan Wolf has helpfully made us see that those are different.
Mm-hmm. So why do you think that death is bad and immortality is good?
Okay, death can be bad and immortality can be good. So death is not necessarily bad. I think when someone is terminally ill or in terrible pain that's not going to be relieved, death is not a bad thing in those cases, or not necessarily a bad thing. But death is bad insofar as it deprives the individual. It's a deprivation of what would be on balance good or worthwhile. And if on balance the life would be good and worthwhile, then in that case death can be bad, even though it doesn't involve, I think, any unpleasant experiences. It's a mere deprivation. Immortality can be horrible, or could be horrible, if an individual is bored and depressed or in pain, misery. Obviously, immortality in that situation is probably hell. It's a good definition of hell. But in my view, we could, and this is where I part company with philosophers like Bernard Williams, and actually more recently Samuel Scheffler in his book After Death, and others, many others, Shelley Kagan in his interesting, they all agree with Williams that living forever would necessarily not be choice-worthy for human beings, because necessarily it would be unattractive and boring. I disagree. I think that under certain hypothetical circumstances in which my health would be good, my economic and situation comfortable and so forth, and I'm living in a reasonably clean environment, and I have friends and colleagues who are also immortal, I could live a life that would be recognizably a human life and choice-worthy. And I think the main reason why people like Bernard Williams think that's impossible is they think we would run out of projects. What gives our lives meaning is our projects, and we would necessarily run out of those projects if we were literally living forever. And that's where we disagree. I think we could still have projects, and I think the projects could be scientific and intellectual projects, but they could also be self-focused projects like meditation or prayer or enjoying fine music, fine food. So I just disagree with what I call the immortality curmudgeons. I think Bernard Williams is an immortality curmudgeon. I've always been amazed, actually, at how many really smart philosophers agree with Bernard Williams. And again, Samuel Scheffler is a really smart philosopher and has a very important new book called Death and the Afterlife with Oxford Press. And it's based on Tanner lectures, and the third lecture is on immortality, and he pretty much just takes up and agrees with Bernard Williams. And I don't know, maybe it's a different personality, but I just think under the right circumstances, I would want to live forever.
So, what do you think is the meaning of life?
That's okay. I have no crisp answer, no good answer. I think meaningfulness. See, I kind of agree with Susan Wolf when she distinguishes the question, what is the meaning of life, from the question of what gives life more meaningfulness. So when you think of the meaning of life, you might think of some single purpose that life has. And maybe the most natural way to think of that would be in terms of a God who gives us a purpose. I don't think myself, I'm not inclined to accept that. I'm not a religious person, and I don't think we do have a purpose that's given to us by God or nature. But I do think that life can be more or less meaningful, and I think the kinds of things that make it more meaningful are engagement with projects that reach beyond ourselves and that connect ourselves with other persons, and some intellectual and artistic and athletic projects that are bigger than us. I think that ultimately, the way I would put it is there are biologists and ethicists, certain ethicists who have accepted the lessons of biology, who think that what we are essentially are machines to pass on our genes. And what I would say, rather, that is helpful to think about is, I think we are machines to pass on our stories. And I think that there's a sense in which, if you can talk about the meaning of life, and not as a purpose, but something that's very basic and very general, I'd say the meaning of our lives is that we are in some way set up to, or designed to, not necessarily by a designer, but by nature, to care about our stories and to pass them along to our colleagues and to our children. And you see this in all the ways we've discussed so far, that what makes us unique and distinctive and different from mere animals, inanimate objects, is we have a dimension of assessment that's essentially narrative. But I would say it's interesting that even as I study near-death experiences, one of the typical components of a near-death experience is a life review, in which the narrative of our life kind of comes before us, and it's almost like a little video that's the highlight of our life. But it seems like it's suggesting that even as we are dying, that we care deeply about our stories and our narrative, and there's a sense in which we're trying to project into the future, into our next life, this story. So I think we're creatures that care deeply about our stories, and it's better to think of ourselves as, it's in a way more attractive and more uplifting and more inspiring to think of us as machines to pass on our stories.
And the last question, please tell us something about your current work and about your future forthcoming books.
Okay, so actually recently I've been working quite a lot on the traditional issues of fatalism and God's foreknowledge and human freedom. Though I myself am not a religious person, I find these intellectually deeply interesting issues, and interestingly connected to questions about causal determinism and freedom. So I've been editing a new anthology that's forthcoming with Oxford University Press, Freedom, Fatalism, and Foreknowledge, with Patrick Todd, who is now at the University of Edinburgh, professor at the University of Edinburgh. And Patrick Todd and I have put together a collection of contemporary work on fatalism, foreknowledge, and free will. And then I'm also in the final process of editing a collection of my own essays on God and free will, which will be forthcoming with Oxford University Press, called Our Fate. And so I've been going back to those very traditional issues, and when I go back to them, though, it's always with an eye to seeking illumination with respect to questions about determinism and questions about moral responsibility. One fascinating kind of issue that's emerging now is, it turns out that in neuroscience there's increasingly the possibility of predicting our future behavior with great accuracy based on neural structures and so forth. And it's interesting to kind of compare questions about God's foreknowledge and accountability and moral responsibility, and how to think about those issues with these questions now of whether, if the neuroscientists can predict in advance how we're going to behave, whether we could be accountable. I also, in terms of longer-term projects, I'm working on projects on death, meaning of life, and finally a book on freedom and autonomy, responsibility, and manipulation. So looking very carefully at the four-case argument and manipulation arguments in general. And I'm seeking to illuminate them by distinguishing between moral responsibility and autonomy, which I think is closely related to responsibility, but interestingly different. I appreciate your question. It gives me a little chance to finally say something about my collaborator for many years, Anthony Bruckner, and he was a very close friend and a wonderful collaborator. We met, just like I met Mark Revisa at Yale University, I met Anthony Bruckner when we were both faculty members in the philosophy department at Yale in the 1980s. And we started writing about death and about the great argument by Lucretius. Lucretius argued that, we shouldn't worry about the prospect of our own death because we don't care about all the time before we were born, and the time after we die is the mirror image of the time before we were born, so we shouldn't care. So Tony Bruckner and I wrote about a dozen articles together trying to respond to Lucretius's argument and discuss the various responses to our strategy. We had a lot of fun doing it, and it was a wonderful collaboration. And we were talking about putting it together into a book, but then unfortunately he passed away recently, at a very young age, very sadly. But in any case, in the future I would like to rework it into a monograph and in his honor, and that's something that I'd like to do. I may have to be immortal to get all these projects finished. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Very much.
Okay, spasibo.